Hey everybody, this is How to Read the Bible. It is a field guide for spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible. And what we're going to do is take a look today at the book of Leviticus. I know this is everybody's favorite book of the Bible, Leviticus, right? There's a lot here, even though a lot of it is really, really strange and bizarre, and there's this temptation to kind of throw out the entire book and say, well, it doesn't really apply today, let alone this week. We want to push back up against that and say there's probably something here. There's things that we can learn. There's things that we can take away from this very strange book of the Bible. But first, an overview of what we're talking about in Leviticus, and as well as this entire series, is that the problem that a lot of us face is that the Bible is a collection of writing over thousands of years by dozens of different authors. There's hundreds of locations, some of them obscure, and there's confusing theological issues at stake. And so there's a temptation, not just with Leviticus, but with the whole Bible, to just throw it out. And that's not what we want to do. Is we want to learn a new way of reading the Bible. We want to learn to read the Bible through the lens of Jesus, and reading every page and every chapter and every verse as it points our way toward Jesus. And we're going to do that again in the book of Leviticus. But first, let's ask some questions. So in your group time, or maybe alone by yourself, however you're watching this, take just a minute and answer these questions. What do you know about Leviticus? What happened in the book of Leviticus? Who's in it? When did it happen? List as many facts as you can as a group. And you can go ahead and hit pause now and answer those questions. All right, welcome back. I hope you had a pretty good conversation about the book of Leviticus, and we're going to go on and start to answer some of those things. Again, Leviticus, it's a strange book of the Bible. It's called, the theme of it is how to be holy. And it seems like there's some really bizarre instructions on how to be holy. So, for example, some of the restrictions, some of the rules in Leviticus seem to make a lot of sense. Like there's dietary restrictions around split-hooved animals such as pig, pork, especially maybe if something wasn't going to be cooked thoroughly and people could get sick. It seemed like God was doing this, installing these rules in order for the people's best interest, to keep them healthy. There's a restriction against eating bats. That seems like a really good idea. There's other good rules like no hitting or grabbing below the belt. I mean, we even have that rule a lot of times today in a lot of contexts, like boxing or any kind of other wrestling. It's a rule that still applies today. But there's also some strange rules that don't seem like they make any sense. Like there's a prohibition against wearing mixed woven fabrics. So like no plaid. There's a restriction against tearing your robes, especially if you're a priest. There's a restriction, or there's a command, direct command, that all the sacrifices that have to be offered up to God must include salt. Actually, I think that makes probably a lot of sense. I think that's maybe a good restriction to have, that offerings should include salt. I think probably, if it's up to me, all the food that we should include more salt. But maybe that's just me. Getting into the book of Leviticus, though, we want to take a look at historically where were the people of God on this journey. This is a time period. Remember last week from the Exodus story that Moses had just led God's people through the wilderness, and they're on the edge. They're on the precipice of entering into the land of Canaan, the land of promise that was called to them. They were just about to enter their forever home, their final destination, the place that they have been journeying towards for a long, long time. And now in the desert, God is preparing them, and He's installing these rules and these restrictions. And some of them seem pretty plain. I mean, some of them seem pretty pedantic, maybe, or childish. I know a lot of these rules that you think, really, did those need to be said? Well, I just encourage you to think about it like with your own children, if you have any. A lot of the rules that you set up, a lot of the rules that I set up, I don't expect my kids to abide by for their whole life, but it makes sense for the stage that they're in. So, for example, I don't let the kids touch the pots and pans when there's heat underneath them on the stove. That's a good rule when they're little. That's a less good rule when they're teenagers, and that's definitely not a rule that I would expect them to carry on in adulthood. Could you imagine that? Not touching the pots and pans. And so that's a way of reading the book of Leviticus and saying, well, what's maybe the thing behind the thing? What's maybe the reason, the why behind all of these rules? How is God training them? How is God preparing them? How is God shaping and forming them and us to be a people of God, to be a holy people of God? Key passage from Leviticus 11:44 is, be holy because I am holy. In fact, that is a phrase, holy or being holy, that is repeated throughout the book of Leviticus many, many, many times. But this is what I'd like to do. I'd like to give you a macro structure of the book of Leviticus, of what this whole book is actually about. We have in Leviticus, they're set up 5 main sacrifices that are commanded one, and each communicates what it means to be holy. In other words, what it means to be set apart. And so we're going to take a look at the burnt offering that's set up in chapter 1. That's the first one. Burnt offering, which was that the offering had to be burned entirely, through and through, leading to a total surrender. There was a grain offering set up in chapter 2, which was God's signifying of God's gracious provision, that they would burn up some of their grain, knowing that God was going to provide for them. Again and again. And then a fellowship offering, chapter 3, which indicated this peace with God, this fellowship with God, the relationship that they had with God. And then a sin or an atonement offering in chapter 4, which is acknowledging the wrongdoing that they had and knowing that they stepped off from the path. And so just kind of hang on to some of those offerings, because I think that's going to be important for us to not just lose, but I think God is actually going to do something with those even today. So this is what we do when we open up Leviticus, and we want to spot Jesus in Leviticus, and we see that there's 2 elements. There's the priest in Leviticus, and then there's the sacrifice that is offered. These 2 key elements. Now, we have to understand that both the priest and the sacrifice were always imperfect. They weren't quite good enough, and so they had these long rituals that needed to be done on repeat. They needed to be done every single day. The priest would go through these cleansing rituals because the priest was imperfect. The priest wasn't completely holy, and so he would have to get all cleaned up and put the right clothes on. And then also the sacrifice had to be done in the exact sort of way, because the sacrifice was never fully complete. The sacrifice was never perfect. There was always something missing, and so they had to do this every single day on an exact schedule, on a routine. And so there's so many rules and procedures for the sacrifice and the priest to follow alike, and this demand of doing all of these things, this isn't minimized or removed. God doesn't just simply say in the New Testament, I don't care about those things anymore. Those aren't important to me anymore. But no, the point is how it points to Jesus. As we look at Leviticus through the Jesus lens, and we say, if the problem is that as God is shaping and forming his people of how to live in this holy presence of God, and if the problem is that the priest and the sacrifice are both imperfect, are both not quite there, then Jesus is the fulfillment of that as both the flawless sacrifice and the sinless priest. Hebrews chapter 7 picks this up and says it so perfectly. Unlike the other high priests, Jesus, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. Jesus sacrificed for their sins once and for all when he offered himself. So I love this picture of Leviticus as they offer these sacrifices over and over and over, and every time it reminds them and it drills into them that there's something missing. We're not done yet. We're not there yet. And God is saying, yes, you have not arrived yet. There is something missing. This isn't the end of the story. Not yet. I picked up this passage from the Message version of the Bible, from Romans chapter 12. This is the point. The point isn't that we would bring back all of those sacrifices, but that they would all somehow point us to Jesus and his once and for all sacrifice. And I love how Peterson puts it in his version of Romans 12. He says, so here's what I want you to do. God helping you, take your everyday ordinary life, your sleeping, your eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering, embracing what God does for you to the best thing you can do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings out the best of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. That's such a good word, because the people were getting ready to enter into Canaan, and they had this smorgasbord. They had this buffet of different gods and goddesses and practices that they could pick and choose from. And God says, no. I want you to abstain from all of that. And so he puts a fence around his people of protection. And he says, this is how I want you to act. This is what I want you to do. This is how I want you to behave. This is how I want you to believe and to trust me. I want you to be different than the culture around. Is that a word that we need to hear today? Be different than the culture around us? Except for how we're different to the culture around us today isn't just in what we necessarily eat or drink, but it's what we watch. It's what we post online. It's how we communicate with one another. It's different. It's set apart. It's holy. The point is that in Jesus, church, you are holy. And so here's some questions for us to answer together. And I'm going to get them displayed on the screen here. And this is, again, a good time for you in your group setting to review these questions together one by one. And this is a good time to hit pause right now. All right, welcome back. And let's answer some of those questions together. Review in your own words, what is the point of the book of Leviticus? Would you describe yourself as holy? That's a weird adverb or adjective. I'm not really sure. Is that how you would describe yourself, as holy? Typically not, but in Jesus, that's exactly what God says, that we are holy and set apart. Are you cultivating a life of holiness? I think it's a great question. What practices in your life remind you of your relationship with God? Remember the main sacrifices or the main offerings in Leviticus. Name one potential practice that we might use today for each offering back then. So for example, the first one is a burnt offering in chapter 1. Total surrender. I think that's a neat way to think about offering today, and is what can we do, or what's a practice today that would signify total surrender to God. I think in terms of time, giving not just some time over to God, but actually giving the best time over to God. And some of us, that might be waking up in the morning first thing and offering him like the first 10 minutes or 15 minutes of the day and reading from his word in the Bible. That would indicate a total surrender of your whole day to God. For some of us, it's going to be finances, offering him a financial sacrifice, a total surrender. Chapter 2 is the grain offering. Remember, that's what they ate and what they drank, signifying that they believed that God was going to provide for them again and again, and that's what he did, and sustaining them in the desert. I think it's kind of a cool takeaway that if you have the practice in your house of praying before a meal, thanking God for the food literally in front of you, but also the provision of that food. There was a fellowship or a peace offering in chapter 3 indicating their relationship with God. I think a neat way to practice that is just to sit outside in creation and be with God. Sometimes we think about God and he's so set apart and he's so holy and he's so almighty and he's so big, we forget that he's actually near as well, that he actually wants to spend time with you and spend time with him. Enjoy his presence, enjoy that relationship, the peace that you have with God could be your practice. Or a sin offering in chapter 4, simply acknowledging wrong. I read this book just a little while ago, last week, and one of the characters in the book had a habit of every day, at the end of the day, mentally going through his day and calculating some of the errors. That wasn't a Christian perspective at all, but he calculated the errors and some of the missteps, how he mistreated people, or maybe how he was short with people throughout the day. And he cataloged them and he kept track of them because he wanted to do better and he wanted to be better the next day. He's simply acknowledging that he could do or he could be better. And that's what the sin offering was back then. And I think that's a fantastic practice for us to have to today, is maybe go through and just make a catalog or make a list of how is it that we were maybe short with people? How is it that maybe we erred in our practices? Fourth question here is, would someone look on your life today and recognize that you're holy, that you're set apart to God for his purpose? Maybe you know somebody who just comes across as set apart, as holy, and not in a pompous, arrogant, or unknowing kind of way, but maybe you know somebody who just you look at and say, man, they're living for God, and it's inspiring. And last one is, how does your set apartness affect your life, your marriage, your politics, your social media, your media consumption in general, even your recreation time? Final action step for the group is, what is one action that you can take this week to live a more holy, set apart life? Not because we have to, but because in Christ Jesus, God is maturing us into that holy, set apart life. Thanks for hanging out as we dug into Leviticus. We'll see you next time.